morning, Polyphony. It's good to see all of you this morning and to have you with us, Todd Ferguson. Dr. Todd Ferguson is a sociologist at Rice University in Houston, Texas, and is our guest today. He is the director of social sciences of the Social Sciences Quantitative Methods Program and assistant teaching professor of sociology. As a sociologist of religion, Todd's research focuses on congregations and clergy, and most recently he served as the Texas team leader for the Exploring the Pandemic's Impact on Congregations, a nationwide study that used surveys, interviews, and ethnographic techniques to see how COVID changed churches. Before he became a sociologist, Todd was a Baptist pastor in Houston, and this experience led him to become a sociologist so he could have the toolkit necessary to see how large social forces impact people's faith. He earned his PhD in sociology at Baylor University, his MDiv at Duke Divinity School, and his BA in psychology at Baylor. And what brings us together for this Polyphony session is Ferguson's most recent book with co-author Josh Packard entitled Stuck: Why Clergy Are Alienated from Their Calling, Congregation, and Career, and What to Do About It. And Stuck explores pastors who no longer want to lead churches. And using over 40 in-depth interviews with pastors, Ferguson and Packard discovered that it wasn't so much burnout or deconstruction. Instead, large social forces outside the control of the pastors were leading them to follow their calling outside the congregation. Todd, welcome. Thank you for being with us today. We are glad you can share this time with us and impart to us some of the knowledge and the insights you gained from your research. So I'm going to hand things off to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everyone. I love that you said my most recent book. It's my only book. I love it. But I'm excited to talk with you all today. And I love talking with pastors as a former pastor myself. I want to make sure that my book doesn't stay within academics, but Josh Packard and I wrote it for y'all. And so I'm gonna share my screen. My goal today is to share a little bit of what we discovered and then open it up to discussion because I want to have a conversation. I don't want to just present. So I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see, here we go. And move everybody out. There we go. Okay. So, yeah, my book is called Stuck. And the subtitle is Why Clergy Are Alienated from Their Calling, Congregation, and Career. And as a former Baptist pastor, you know, you had to have alliteration with 3 bullet points. And so, and before I get going, I want to preface everything I say with the fact that while the book explores a negative aspect of ministry, I am absolutely not a doomsday sayer about the state of ministry. And that when sociologists survey pastors, most are loving their job. Are there challenges? Absolutely. Is there stress? Absolutely. But most feel like this is where they need to be and they are living into their calling. We wanted to explore the fringes, the people who were expressing some doubts about should they be in congregational ministry. So I want to introduce 2 people to you. First, I want to introduce Marshall. And throughout this, I'm not going to use real names and I'm not going to use real pictures. So if you know the person in the picture, it's because I Googled megachurch pastor or Presbyterian pastor. Okay, so I'm just using Google search. So Marshall, he is a former youth pastor, and he is in the South. I'm not going to get any more specific than that. He's at a megachurch in the South. and he's 44 years old. And when we talked to him, he was questioning whether this gigantic youth ministry was graduating faithful Christians, or was it just providing entertainment? So he had multiple services. He had a Saturday night service just for teenagers. He had 2 Sunday night services. By all means, he was very successful. The church was doing well, and he had a ton of teenagers at his ministry. But he was questioning that. Are they actually discipling people, or is it just, hey, let's have some goofy fun? So he told us when we talked with him, I began to get bitter at the larger church and what it was producing. I want to focus more on disciples. And so for Marshall, he actually moved jobs. Someone contacted him and said, hey, we've got this multi-campus church. It's a satellite system. And this position is not just youth pastor, but it's youth discipleship. And he was like, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to focus on discipleship, growing. So he gets to this new satellite type of congregations, plural congregations, and he realizes that his job was to film sermons in a studio. And those Bible studies, those sermons, those youth group gatherings were then broadcast to the satellites so that each regional youth ministry would have their worship band there, and then they would pull the screen down, and then his Bible study would be broadcast. And so he said, it turns out I'm famous. Like, I would go to these satellite campuses, and everyone knew me because I was the guy offering the message. And he's like, I knew no one. I'm isolated. I'm doing ministry in a box, literally in a box. So he told us, I'm kind of at the top of my game, and you'd be dumb to stop. But knowing that if I stayed in it, it'd be at the cost of my soul. I'd end up dying in this place and becoming part of the system. And so Marshall, I want to contrast that with Marcus. And looking back at this presentation, I should have chosen 2 different pseudonyms, Marshall, Marcus, but that's how they were in the book. He's a Presbyterian pastor. He's in his 30s, and he's also in the South. And every week he's in worship, and he's like, this is no longer a spiritual experience for me. He told us, quote, for a long time, it's felt like work. It's where I go to do what I'm doing for my job. Worship was not a spiritual experience. It wasn't meaningful. It was, let me just get through it because this is what I do for my job. And he started saying, he said, I've begun to see myself as an actor, but not as a participant. And so someone on stage giving a performance, not being able to be his true self and connect with God in a spiritual way. And then as we're talking with him about his dissatisfaction, he says, you never want to know how the sausage is made. You never want to know how the worship service is constructed. All the things that go into planning in order for this worship service to be good. So we actually followed up with Marcus and we said, why do you stay in the ministry? Like, what's going on? Like, you feel like it's a job, but it's not really connecting with you. And he gives us 2 reasons, and 2 reasons in this order. Number 1, stability. As a pastor with the Presbyterian Church USA, he had a great salary. He had a pension. He had a family to raise. It was a stable paycheck. And then number 2 was Jesus. And he actually told us, he's like, sorry, but it's in that order. He still feels called to lead others to Jesus. But for him, the main reason was stability. And he goes further and he says he really doesn't like the fact that the people who are the ones he's serving are the ones who's signing his paycheck. There's that disconnect between, oh, you could fire me, but also I'm supposed to lead you and maybe lead you in some uncomfortable ways. And so he says there's this catch that the congregation is paying you. And so you withhold some of your visions. So those are two examples of the pastors we spoke to for our project Stuck. And so I want to give you some background about how this book was written, how this project was written. Josh Packard, he is now at the National Catholic Education Association. And then I'm at Rice. We're both actually in new roles. Previously, I was at the University of Mary Hardin Baylor, and Josh was with Springtide Institute, which is a research firm that studies religion and spirituality for Gen Z. So the younger high schoolers and younger college students. Josh was on a part of a project looking at the Duns. So we've often heard about the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, where as social scientists we ask, what's your religious tradition? And they go through the checklist and they're like, none. So they click none. He was interested in the Duns. So people who said, I'm Christian, so they clicked on the Christian box. But then as sociologists, we'd ask the next question, well, where do you go to church? And they say, I'm done with that. No, I don't go to church. And so he wrote a book on that called Church Refugees. And we were at a conference one time, and we were just talking about the research. And he said, Todd, I keep having pastors come up to me saying they're done with the church, and I can't figure out what's going on. And so I said, well, let's explore that. Let's work together and explore that. Why would some pastors be done with the church, but not done with faith, not done with Jesus, but done with the church? And so we created a research study and wrote this book, Stuck. And the way our authorship works, he really helped with the interview collection, and then I wrote the book. Basically, we're equal co-authors, but I did most of the analysis, and he did most of the organization of data collecting, even though we interviewed equally. So what we did is we interviewed over 40 pastors who were done with the church, and here I'm talking about capital C church, and we weren't talking about ministers who are done with their local congregation and were looking for someplace else to serve. We were looking at people who no longer thought that the organizational church was working for them. And so our sample, we interviewed people from both Canada and the United States. In terms of religious tradition, this is a Protestant study. So about 23 people were evangelical, 18 were mainline Protestant. One person was categorized as other religious tradition, but his history was within mainline Protestantism. We didn't exclude Catholic priests on purpose. We actually tried really hard to include Catholic priests. We actually got a grant back when Facebook allowed you to have very targeted advertisements. We created advertisements specifically to anyone who said that their job on their Facebook profile was Catholic priest. And we could not recruit. And so part of that is the nature of ordination within Catholicism, the fact that both of us are outsiders. And so unfortunately, this is just a Protestant study, but at the same time, it allows us to see really the distinctions between mainline Protestantism and evangelicalism. We interviewed both men and women, and this is reflective of the overall percentage of pastors who are female. And so that's somewhat representative, though the sample that we have is not representative of all pastors, because this was an interview project. We weren't trying to say all pastors feel like this, or here's a percentage of pastors who feel like this. We were trying to hear the stories of pastors who did feel like they were done. So what we found were that there were three gigantic social forces affecting congregations. We initially hypothesized that this was going to be a story of deconstruction, of losing faith, or of changing faith. And we didn't find that. We asked every single respondent, do you still feel called? And overwhelmingly, they said, yes, I feel called to serve. I feel called to be a leader. I feel called to be a spiritual leader. So it wasn't about deconstruction. It wasn't about burnout because they still felt that like joy, that energy of calling. What we did find were there were gigantic social forces going on. So the first is social Darwinism, or survival of the fittest. And I mean, y'all are pastors, y'all know this. If a church doesn't bring in enough money and members, the two resources that really matter for survivability, they're going to close down. It might not be soon, it might be a generation, it might be 50 years, but over time, that congregation will cease. Congregations are competing with each other for members and money. Congregations are competing for outside activities for members and money. It is absolutely survival of the fittest. Okay. The second social force was capitalism. So capitalism infuses our entire society. It's what we're built on. But that leads congregations to have a focus on numbers, growth, money, and also to look at businesses, for-profit businesses, as the model to replicate. So the third factor is secularization. There are just fewer religious people. The pool of potential members, along with their money, it's decreasing. In every measure we have, there are just fewer religious people. So the first two things, social Darwinism, capitalism, nothing's new there. We've had competition and we've had capitalism since the founding of our nation. We don't have a state-imposed church tax or state-supported church. It's survival of the fittest. What is new and what has changed the rules of the game is secularization. So the rules of the game have been grow your congregation or close, nothing new there. But now it's the pool of potential members is shrinking. That dynamic with those three gigantic social forces that are outside of the congregation, outside of the clergy, that's affecting these pastors. So we found that clergy were stuck for three main reasons. One, I'm going to call the alienation of faith. Two, the congregation is a business. And then three, the decline of congregations. For today, I actually just want to focus on two of them. Alienation of faith and the decline of congregations. Later on in discussion, if you want to talk about the business aspect, we can absolutely go into that. But I want to focus on two because I think those are the two that would be most applicable for Polyphony. So decline of congregations, I want to start there actually. What we found is that especially mainline Protestants, and it's interesting, as sociologists, we are still trying to figure out what CBF is categorized as. Is it categorized as mainline Protestantism or is it categorized as evangelical Protestantism? There's debate about that. But in our sample with mainline Protestants, they are leading in this massive change that we're seeing decline of religious attendance, the number of religious members. And yet, pastors are being held accountable. If more members are not coming, if budgets are dwindling, it's often the pastors who are blamed. And so they feel like they're working harder with fewer resources. They feel like they're trying more and more and more and more, and the outcomes are less and less and less. So I want to show this. This is church membership from 2000 to 2019. And the blue groups are mainline Protestants. Those are what are called the Seven Sisters, the seven historic denominations that are associated with the National Council of Churches. Mainline Protestants are more open to women in ministry, more open to LGBTQ issues. And we can see that every single group is shrinking. The Presbyterian Church USA has shrunk the most, and the American Baptist churches have shrunk the least, but they're all are shrinking over time. In terms of evangelical Protestants, and that would be congregations that are more conservative on issues of women and maybe marriage, and they're usually not associated with the National Council of Churches. Most are growing except for three groups. The two evangelical Lutheran groups, so the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod, and then the Southern Baptists. The data came out 2 days ago for 2023 numbers for the Southern Baptist Convention, and they are continuing to see a decline. So this 9% would actually be lower if I updated this through 2023. The other evangelical groups are growing. And then with Catholicism, it's holding steady at 3%, but if we split it out, white Catholic parishes versus Latino Hispanic Catholic parishes, white Catholic parishes would look like mainline Protestants, they're shrinking, and Latino Catholic parishes would look like evangelical Protestants, they're growing. So it's in this dynamic that pastors are leading, especially mainline Protestants. And so Helen, she's an Episcopal priest. She's nearing retirement. She says, when things don't go right, it's the clergy's fault. And when she was talking to us, she was spunky. It was fun to talk with her. So she says, when things don't go right, it's the clergy's fault. The fact that your church is not full isn't because the community is changing and that there are 6 big churches on the corners and there aren't enough people to fill them. It's because the priest isn't doing his or her job. And then she goes on to tell us, like, she's focused on spiritual growth, spiritual discipleship. And she says, I don't think keeping a building open is important, but that's the majority of her job, trying to keep a building open. Glenn, who's a Presbyterian pastor, he says, I took for granted a whole bunch of things, that there will always be a church as we know it, that there would always be a church hierarchy, that you would need a pastor, an associate pastor, an organist, a choir director, and elders. You just trusted that would always be there. And as he's talking to us, he gets sadder and angrier. And so towards the end of his interview, he says, this isn't working. And I'm working harder to do this. I mean, really a lot harder. Glenn's story was powerful because he talks about working in this historically large Presbyterian church, and it's no longer large. Instead, it's a large empty building. And he said, people say, you know, a generation ago, we had a Sunday school full of kids. We had to set up chairs in the sanctuary. And part of me wants to say, are you telling me that if I worked harder or if I was better, this would happen? Is that what you're saying? Because that's not true. And so Glenn's story really expresses what we call both grief and nostalgia. You know, there's a lot of nostalgia going, like they see these large buildings, these large sanctuaries that are empty or partially empty on Sundays. And there's nostalgia there. Like, do you remember when? You remember when we did this? But there's also grief, like they've lost something. And yet the pastors feel like they're blamed for that loss. So what I want to do is, and now I want to actually open it up for discussion. I've got some guided discussion questions for us. And I'm going to just put all of these up. Excuse me. I'll read them out, and then I'm going to open it up for y'all to, let's have a conversation. So how have you seen congregations in decline over the years? How has that affected your ministry? Do you feel like you're working harder with fewer resources? What stories do congregations tell about the past? Do you hear stories of the good old days? How does that make you feel? And then is there a sense of grief and nostalgia amongst your congregants? So I'd love to open it up.
I would say, Todd, that could answer any of these. I could answer any of these with yes and no nos in this list. Um, and I venture to guess others can too. I'll just focus on briefly working harder with fewer resources. I think that has been my 20 plus years in ministry, be that part-time and full-time, that's been a common theme. That I felt like what I saw growing up in my childhood and youth was that you had all these resources, and the perception was it was always going to be there. And then when I've entered into full-time ministry, starting in part-time ministry, I feel like the first half of my career, I'm in my mid 40s now, has just been defined by work harder with less results than what I think my predecessors had a generation ago.
Mhm.
Yeah. Others?
I think not only fewer financial resources, but fewer people resources. As we're talking, the shrinking pool of potential members that directly affects our music ministry when we're talking about, singers in choir and that sort of thing.
See the first question.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
I feel like I work hard on trying to get more singers involved in the choir, the church choir. And there just seem to be, I just don't feel like I'm very successful at getting more people, the newer people to come in as the dedicated members are getting older. Yeah.
And my experience at least is that something, a smaller choir is something that everybody sees when they come to church. That's there's a sense of judgment about that easy numerical marker every week. How big was the choir yesterday? That's
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Measure the value of what you're doing. It's quantitative instead of qualitative. Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have seen the Wednesday night. Is it written down in the Bible that you have to have choir on Wednesday night, choir rehearsal or something? But the Wednesday night attendance at our church and many of our colleagues has declined. And so we're thinking of, changing it up and not having, having to navigate the Wednesday night. But I guess I wonder if that's really the problem. I mean, I don't know that the scheduling is really the problem. That's what I'm trying to say. I feel like people make time to do what they want to do.
Yeah, I think of number one when I look at this, and for me personally, it feels as though in order to try to fight against the decline, the way that's affected my ministry is then I have to shift what I really believe is important to something that they may see as culturally important. And so then I'm sacrificing what I see as truths for a carrot to get people to either show up or participate. because it's important to keep the building open, like you said. Yeah, I don't know. It feels wrong. And so I'm not being a true steward of spiritual gifts. I'm just being a steward of, I've got to have people here, so I've got to make it work regardless.
Hmm.
Todd, related to question number 4, do you have insights about sort of post-pandemic grief and nostalgia?
Yeah. So after I wrote this book, and the book doesn't address the pandemic because I was writing it during the pandemic. We interviewed people before that, but afterwards, yeah, I was a part of a study that we interviewed people within churches, we surveyed them, and then we observed them for many, many hours in worship. And what we're seeing, even before the pandemic, we're seeing a bifurcation of churches. So the churches that are healthy, and here I'm putting healthy, I'm speaking as a sociologist, not as a theologian. So hear me on that. I'm not saying
Okay.
spiritually healthy. In terms of money and members, resource health, we're seeing that those churches are doing great. They are not declining, they are growing. And most people, the average church-going American, goes to a big church. But the average church is like 70 members. So there are all of these tiny or small or even medium-sized churches where most members are actually in the few big churches. We are seeing, before the pandemic, we saw the well-resourced churches, they're humming along, they're thriving. Everything in that medium category and down is struggling. And then the pandemic hits, and it just amplified that pattern. Churches that were doing well, the bigger churches, their giving increased from the pandemic, membership increased. Anything in that medium category and down, budgets, financial giving might have actually increased a little bit because you had automatic online giving, but volunteerism, membership, it gutted it. And across traditions, at least for the Texas team, we were in a Hispanic speaking church, an Episcopal church, a cowboy church, which is unique to Texas, Oklahoma area, and a Catholic parish. And like the cowboy church, it was growing already and it grew even more. They are in a healthier position. But the Catholic parish, the Hispanic speaking Baptist church, and then and another like legacy downtown type church, Baptist church, they're struggling. And so it's like the pandemic, it didn't change the trajectory of congregations, it sped it up. Like if a church had like 50 more years in its lifespan, the pandemic shortened it to 30 years or maybe 25 years. And so that's what we saw. And it's the accelerant.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if, so on your chart, you had mainstream churches, kind of more established denominational types of churches. And I'm wondering if the decline is because there are so many newer plants coming up and a lot of them are a more modern style. And so they're recreating, they're creating what they want, which is easier than trying to push something onto a more established church. So I'm wondering if If decline is, if church people are moving over to these newer churches, because it's harder to pivot at the more established churches. Not that pivoting saves your church necessarily, but
Right.
it does add another option for people to stay.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research on why the mainline churches are declining. One of them is one reason, and we don't think about it, but it's fertility, just simple demography. Evangelical families have more kids per family than mainline Protestants. So on the one hand, they're just not having enough babies. And so like over time, most people don't change their religious tradition over their lifetime. Their level of religion and spirituality pretty much stay the same. But then if you don't replicate that through families, you don't grow. In fact, you shrink. And another reason is the culture wars. So mainline Protestants won the culture war in terms of the larger culture. They're egalitarian, they're open to women in ministry, they're open to LGBTQ members. They're more open to talking about racial justice issues, and that's where the culture is. It's sort of like a paradox that if you win the culture war, organizationally, you've weakened yourself. And the reason why is because if a family, let's say a family, they're progressive, they want women in ministry, they want open and affirming congregation or open and affirming place, they don't have to go to a church to find that. They can go to anywhere in the larger culture because there's no distinction between mainline Protestants and the larger culture. Let's flip it though. If a family's like, nope, we want a traditional view of marriage and we're not open to women in ministry, we're more patriarchal, they can't find that in the open culture. They have to either go to an evangelical or a conservative Catholic parish. And so by winning the culture war, they actually organizationally weaken themselves. And then I do think this idea of like, I mean, and y'all are at the front lines of worship. I think worship style might have an effect. Mm-hmm. It's a great question, Tracy.
Yeah, it Todd, is the research then, if I'm following you right on this, is the churches that are growing after the pandemic that have continued, the bigger churches that continue to grow, are they culturally more conservative? Is there indicators of those churches are resistant to culture, like trying to be other, as opposed to most mainline churches are that are trying to be more open and progressive? And
yeah, it's funny, like I saw both. So
okay,
one Episcopal church that we observed, it's sort of the Star Episcopal Church in Texas, if that makes sense. And they were thriving, and they're within the Episcopal Church, and they actually were thriving because during the pandemic, they had public health officials in their congregation. And so and this is in Texas, so the cultural context matters here. While some congregations were like, screw you, government, we're opening, we're not wearing masks, we're not vaccinating, this Episcopal church said, we've got a situational matrix, and if the case counts in our county are this, we will do this. And they had it staggered, so like not meeting virtual, meeting in the parking lot, meeting inside with masks, meeting inside without masks. And it was very much set based off of their public health officials within their congregation. The vaccination status of every choir member and clergy was published in the bulletin. And so because they did that, like it said, all clergy and choir members have been vaccinated. The people in this region who saw their other congregations open up what they felt like was reckless behavior, they flocked to this Episcopal church, both in terms of Catholics and evangelical Protestants and mainline Protestants going to this evangelical church. So that was one. So it was more progressive. They were very clear. But if we think about that theory of if you look like the culture, you're organizationally weaker, they didn't look like the culture. They were distinct from the culture. The culture was very conservative, and so the progressive part led them to be organizationally strong. The flip, the cowboy church that we saw, they were the screw you government type, and they also recruited members because they were very open and vocal on social media about their practices, that we're meeting, don't wear a mask, don't get vaccinated. And so the flip side, people who were in more hesitant congregations, they went to there. So we saw both, but the key I think would be, if you are progressive, you have to be distinct from the surrounding culture somehow in order to be organizationally strong.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I want to move on to my second part. So there's time to discuss this as well. I actually want to move on to the alienation of faith. So this idea of alienation is an idea of separation. And so there is this theory that whatever you use in your job that is sold on a marketplace. Okay, so whatever you use in your job that's sold in a marketplace, you have the potential to feel alienated from or separated from. So before we get to clergy, I'll give you an example. So there was some research in the late 70s with flight attendants. They called them stewardesses back then. They were all women. And the women were selling, as flight attendants, warm, good feelings and smiles. You know, you walk into a plane and the airline flight attendant is smiling and she's like, welcome, welcome, you know. And then they talk about the safety protocols and they're still smiling and they're like, you know, I'm smiling. We're not going to crash today. We're safe. I'm smiling. Can I get you a beverage? You know, and the sociologist who studied them, she realized that the smile was being sold. And so when these women would get home or they would hang out with their friends and they would smile, in the back of their mind, they were thinking, wait, was that smile real? Or was that a requirement of my job? Are my smiles real anymore? Or is it because I've been trained, if I don't smile, I don't get my paycheck? They felt alienated from their emotions. We took that theory of alienation, it's called alienation of labor.
Okay.
And we brought it to the idea of the pastors. So pastors use their faith for their jobs. Literally, that is what they're doing. And ultimately, that product, faith, is being sold because we're in a competition. So if pastors don't have a great experience on Sunday mornings, people don't come back. If people don't come back, they don't give to the offering. And so the pastors we spoke to felt like they were producing a product. And they used that language of manufacturing, production. We've even seen it earlier, acting. And I think this is what may be most applicable for music ministers and worship leaders. So Adam, he was a former non-denominational pastor. He says, everything is so manufactured. And there's that manufactured word. It's factory language. He said, I remember during our summer, we had some people on vacation. We pulled chairs out from the auditorium, so it made it look fuller in the service. I was acting out of desperation because I knew I needed to maintain a certain level of production within the ministry. There's that production word. Thomas is no longer a Baptist pastor. Now he directs a nonprofit. He says, your portrayal of your humanity is your job security, right? If you can't manufacture an experience, you lose your job. And so the pastors we spoke to felt like they were producing something to be broadcast from the stage. And then they questioned, was what I was producing to create that experience, was that actually real? And so because of that, because they asked the question, is this real? They struggle with authenticity. So Peter, pastor of a massive megachurch, but he's now a storage facility manager. He says, it was depressing to get out on the church's stage because there was the expectation of what would take place and how it would be evaluated afterwards. It just wasn't authentic. It wasn't real transformation. It was a job. And Peter actually talked to us about the story that for him, it clicked. Like, I don't need to be doing this anymore. So he was at this mega church. He was on stage. He wanted to make a teaching point in a sermon that connected personally with a woman who was on the front row towards the side of the stage. So during his sermon, he walked over to that side of the stage and like knelt down to say like, oh yeah, you remember blah, blah, blah. And he actually got the woman's permission and everything. He didn't just single her out randomly. But while he was doing that, trying to make a connection with the congregant, trying to make it more personal, the tech team in the back of the sanctuary was like motioning him to get back in the spotlight, to stand on his little taped X, because the production value just went down.
Mm-hmm.
He was out of the spotlight. He couldn't be seen by the cameras. So the YouTube video or the streaming service wasn't picking him up. And he was like, what am I doing? I wanted to make a connection with someone. I'm a spiritual leader. I wanted to help them connect, make this more personal. And all I was doing was I was not acting correctly. I wasn't living up to the production. So Jeff, he recently resigned. He was with the, I don't have this on there, but he was with the ABC, the American Baptist Churches. He was an interview that was just really emotionally hard to hear and go through. So he says, when you're trying to lead worship in a way that doesn't, and here he stumbles for words. And as a researcher, anytime someone stumbles for words, that's actually really important because it means they haven't really thought through that process yet. Or they might have mixed feelings, or they haven't really wrestled with it. So he says, well, you're trying to lead worship in a way that doesn't, it doesn't diminish your own personal, like that's the struggle. It's to not lose yourself in the process. And so I followed up and said, why is that such a struggle? And he got really quiet here. And he said, I'm afraid if I share too much about myself, then I'll overwhelm everybody. And so here he felt like within his role as a pastor, he couldn't be authentic. Because if he overwhelms people, they wouldn't want to keep him on the job. They wouldn't pay his paycheck. And so he finally quit. And it was really recent. He was raw when we spoke to him. I think he was probably 3 weeks out. Nancy, an Episcopal priest, she's about to retire. She says, so there's always a level at which I'm wondering how fully I can share myself and my humanity because of a sense of judgment. It's difficult to share your own doubts and fears because people count on you to have the answer. And so she was withholding some of her authentic self in order to do her job. So our discussion questions for this: do you ever feel a disconnect between the official faith you present to your congregation and your own personal faith? Do you struggle with being authentic with your congregation? Are you allowed to reveal your true self? And then how can pastors lead worship at the same time meaningfully participate in worship? And then this is what we also discovered. Pastors talked about they never worshiped in a setting where they didn't produce the worship. So my question is, how often do you get to worship in a context where you've not produced anything? So the title of the book at the end has the ... and what to do about it. And to be honest, as a sociologist, our job is to say, here's what it is. We don't deal with what to do about it. And my editor at Fortress Press was like, no, you have to do something about it. So I spent an entire summer, and I took off my sociologist hat and I had to go back to my MDiv training and my pastoral training to really think about, like, what is the response? I offer 3 big ones, but I'm going to show just 2 of them. I'm not going to cover all of them, but one is close, struggling congregations. That is easier to say, it's easier to write in a book, but it's so difficult. When congregations when they're declining so much that the worship life is diminished, resources, you can't pay a pastor full-time. And we saw a lot of that. The pastors coming to us, they were like, my church can't even afford a full-time salary anymore, but they're expecting me to do this work. So one thing we need to talk about, and that really at the denominational level, is how do you have holy deaths? Congregations have lifespans just like we humans do. So there are churches in their infancy, childhood, those energetic childhood years, the awkward teenage years, the stable, mature middle-age years, the plateaued, maybe declining a little bit, senior citizen years, and then the stages of real decline and death. And it's very, very, very rare to have a declining older congregation transform and go back to that infancy stage. It happens, and that's usually what we focus on, but that is so rare. And so I think with denominations, we need to say, we really need to have church plants, create more babies in congregations, but also how do we have holy deaths? How do we walk through congregations to celebrate their ministry, to say thank you for the work in the community, but also we need to close. And that's really hard. The other is how do we give pastors space to be authentic, to worship without producing? Some denominations, some groups are better at this. They have that built into their clergy groups. So they will have pastoral groups within the community that they talk to each other regularly. They meet once a month. And then they'll have quarterly worship services for pastors that the pastors have not worshiped or created the worship. But some are really isolated. And so those are just 2 of the recommendations. There are more in the book. But the goal of the book was to give a voice to pastors who felt like they were alone. And we even had pastors whisper to us, hey, I think I want to be part of your study. Because who can tell their congregant, hey, I'm leading you, or the congregation, I'm leading you, but I don't want to do this anymore. That's really challenging. So I want to leave it there. I want to be aware of your time. So if you have any final discussions, I'm happy to hang on afterwards. I know people need to leave, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, let me just say one thing, Todd, about could you pull those last 2 statements up?
Yeah.
You just had. given the space for that authentic worship, I had a former youth choir student reach out to me who's now a youth minister at a Methodist congregation. And she asked me to come and lead worship for a confirmation weekend. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And then when I got there, I didn't realize how much more I needed that than maybe they did.
Mm.
And it was really powerful. And I'm not even sure how often I do that, just personally lead worship. But now that's that's the most favorite thing I do all year long is lead worship for my friend's congregation. And it's led to their youth camp, so now I'm doing it twice a year at their confirmation in the winter and for their youth trip during the summer. And it is so great to be authentic. And they're not my kids, so it doesn't matter. I can be as
Yeah,
authentic with
yeah.
them as possible. But it's really powerful. So it's a gift. It's a gift to be able to have that opportunity, put it that way.
That's great.
I don't think there's anything when you say yes, it's easier to write it down, Todd, close struggling congregations, but there's also some kind of beauty and when you in the book you say this church that closes, then they can share their resources with others who are doing work and good, and that the Holy Spirit is still moving. I felt like just knowing you and your optimism, I wasn't surprised that you ended all these sad stories with a message of hope and promise in your conclusions. And yeah, I think about what that might mean in my context here, when we're trying to revitalize things here in our church, and I think every church represented in this group of people here and others who will listen to this later are trying to do new things and I left thinking from reading the book thinking, okay, there's hope for the church because of the Holy Spirit. The Spirit is alive and moving in new ways. There's something new emerging. We're obviously in a major shift culturally. I think to Phyllis Tickle's book, the late Phyllis Tickle, The Emergent Church, The Great Emergence, and every 500 years, her premise, every 500 years, the church has to have a rummage sale, and we're in the midst of that kind of shift. The Great Reformation being the previous rummage sale of sorts. And I just think about all the things that we're reading and talking about the last 20 years or more in our professions and career paths, and I think, well, we can reimagine with with God's Spirit leading us. There's new things to think about, and institutions, I still think what we do institutionally is important, but it needs to be renovated. Like we take an old house. I live in an old neighborhood in St. Louis, and everyone's renovating these beautiful homes. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think too, the question about like, where is St. Augustine's church? It's no longer here. Even the form of that church really isn't present. There are elements of it. So if a church closes down, that's okay. And we actually should expect it. We should expect churches to have life cycles. And I think about the former suburban churches. So Kyle, Tracy, we all served in Willow Meadows or Westbury, and it was a former suburban church. So like the 1950s, 1960s, every city has a ring of former suburbia, massive building campaigns with congregations. We have these gigantic sanctuaries of every denomination. Those sanctuaries are now empty. The downtown legacy churches, they're going to be fine. They've got some historical, cultural cachet. The now suburban churches are growing because that's where families and fertility are. But it's those former suburban ring congregations. The neighborhoods all have 1950s, 60s homes in them. Those congregations need to have real serious conversations about how do you have a holy, positive closing.
Mhm. Very good. Well, thank you, Todd, very much. Thank you for your work, your continued work, and to this group, thank you for gathering with us today. And I will close now with our friend Terry York's benediction for church musicians, which is, I think, a appropriate way to close today after this topic. And now to you who have been called to sing amid the shouts and cries and slogans, to you who have been called to sing love to hearts full of hate, to sing truth in the cacophony of falsehood, to sing community in the barren places of isolation, to sing peace in the midst of deadly conflict, to sing embrace in the midst of denial. To you, musicians of the song of grace, may God grant always yet another song of courage to be hummed until God's words appear at the time of testing. Amen.
Amen. Thank y'all so much for letting me speak with y'all.